Most people misunderstand silence. They think silence means weakness. They think silence means surrender. They think silence means a person has nothing left to say. But when an empath goes quiet after being hurt, something very different is happening beneath the surface. The average person sees the silence and assumes the situation is over. The empath knows the situation has only moved inward. That's the first thing most people miss. Empaths are not primarily external processors. They are internal processors. When something painful happens, they don't immediately move toward confrontation. They move toward analysis. They replay conversations. They replay facial expressions. They replay tone of voice. They replay small moments that everyone else forgot 20 minutes ago. Their minds begin searching for meaning. Not because they enjoy suffering. Not because they want drama. Because understanding matters deeply to them. Most people hear words. Empaths absorb emotional context. They don't just remember what happened, they remember how it felt. They remember the emotional atmosphere. They remember the shift in energy when someone became distant. They remember the tension hidden behind a smile. They remember the moment something felt different, even if nobody else noticed it. This creates a unique challenge, because when an empath is hurt, they are rarely dealing with one event. They are dealing with layers. Layers of observations, layers of emotional signals, layers of contradictions. Layers of things that don't make sense. And before they decide how to respond, they need to organize all of it internally. The silence begins there. Not as punishment, not as manipulation, as processing. Most people want immediate answers. The empath wants accurate answers, and accuracy takes time. One of the biggest misconceptions about empathetic people is that they are emotionally fragile. They are not. Many are actually extraordinarily resilient. The problem isn't weakness, the problem is depth. They feel things deeply, they observe deeply, they care deeply, and because they invest emotionally at a deeper level, wounds often travel deeper as well. Imagine two people standing in the rain. One person gets slightly wet. The other person absorbs every drop like a sponge. The storm affects both people, but the experience is not the same. It's often what emotional pain feels like for highly empathetic individuals. The impact lingers longer, not because they choose it, because they absorb more information from the experience. Most people recover by moving on. Empaths recover by making sense of what happened. Till that process is complete, silence becomes their refuge. What makes this even more fascinating is that many empaths are highly aware of other people's emotional states while remaining surprisingly private about their own. They can sense tension in a room instantly. They can identify sadness behind a smile. They can detect frustration in a person's voice. Yet when they are hurting, they often reveal very little. This creates confusion. People assume that someone so emotionally aware would naturally communicate their own pain openly. But awareness and expression are not the same thing. In fact, the more emotionally intelligent a person becomes, the more selective they often become about vulnerability. They understand the cost of exposing pain to the wrong person. Understand how easily emotions can be dismissed, misunderstood, weaponized, ignored. So when they are hurt, they don't automatically reach outward. They retreat inward. Not because they don't care, because they care enough to protect what is happening inside. There is another layer most people never see. Empaths often spend enormous amounts of time carrying emotional weight for others. They become listeners, support systems, problem solvers, emotional anchors. People bring them stress, fear, anxiety, frustration, heartbreak, and the empath listens, absorbs, supports, encourages. Repeats the process. Over time, this creates a hidden imbalance. The empath becomes accustomed to being the safe place for everyone else. But they may not always have a safe place of their own. When they are hurt, they suddenly face a difficult question. Who carries the carrier? Who listens to the listener? Who understands the person who spends all their time understanding everyone else? The answer is often nobody, at least not immediately. So they become their own support system, their own therapist, their own investigator, their own emotional refuge. That process requires solitude. The silence is not emptiness. The silence is work, internal work, complex work, work that nobody else can see. Another reason empaths become quiet when hurt is that they tend to analyze intent. Most will focus on behavior. Empaths focus on meaning. They want to know why something happened. Was it intentional? Was it careless? Was it selfishness? Was it misunderstanding? Was it stress? Was it insecurity? Was it fear? These questions matter enormously to them, because the answer determines how they interpret the entire situation. A harsh comment spoken in cruelty feels different from a harsh comment spoken in exhaustion. The behavior may be identical. The meaning changes everything. And until they understand the meaning, they often remain silent. Not because they are avoiding reality, because they are searching for it. The deeper the emotional investment, the longer this process can take, especially when betrayal is involved. Betrayal affects empaths differently than many people realize. The pain rarely comes from the event itself. The pain comes from the collapse of trust. Empaths spend tremendous energy understanding others. When someone betrays them, it creates a psychological conflict. They begin questioning their own perception. How did I miss this? Were the signs always there? Did I ignore them? Did I misunderstand this person completely? Was the connection real, or was I imagining it? Notice what's happening. The empath isn't only grieving the action. They're grieving the meaning behind the action. They're grieving the version of reality they believed existed, and rebuilding that reality requires reflection. Silence becomes the environment where that rebuilding happens. One of the most dangerous mistakes people make is assuming an empath's silence means forgiveness. It doesn't. Silence and forgiveness are separate processes. An empath may stop arguing long before they stop hurting. They may stop explaining long before they stop caring. They may stop speaking long before they stop noticing. In fact, many empathetic individuals become quiet precisely because they have noticed too much. They have observed patterns, inconsistencies, repeated disappointments, broken promises, dismissed feelings, ignored boundaries, and eventually they realize something important. Not everyone wants understanding. Some people only want access. Not everyone wants connection. Some people only want convenience. Realization changes people, particularly empathetic people, because empathy naturally assumes mutuality. It assumes that care will be returned, effort will be returned, consideration will be returned. When that assumption repeatedly proves false, silence often follows. Not angry silence. Not dramatic silence. Observational silence. The kind of silence that appears when someone begins seeing things clearly. There is a moment many empaths experience that almost nobody talks about. A moment when exhaustion replaces emotion. At first they feel hurt, disappointed, then confused, then frustrated, then sad. Then eventually something shifts. The emotional intensity fades. Not because healing is complete, because depletion has arrived. They become tired of explaining, tired of defending their feelings, tired of asking for understanding, tired of repeating conversations that never change outcomes. This is often when the silence becomes most noticeable, because it no longer feels temporary. It feels different. Calmer, colder, more deliberate. People around them often misinterpret this stage completely. They assume the empath no longer cares. The truth is often the opposite. The empath cared for so long that emotional exhaustion finally forced withdrawal. There's an important distinction between emotional withdrawal and emotional indifference. Indifference feels nothing. Withdrawal feels too much. One is absence, the other is overload. Empaths frequently enter silence because their emotional system has reached capacity. Think of a computer running too many programs simultaneously. Eventually performance slows. Not because the system is broken, because resources are exhausted. Human beings work similarly, especially people who absorb emotional information intensely. At some point, they need space. Space to reset, space to process, space to separate their emotions from everyone else's emotions. Without that space, clarity becomes impossible. And clarity matters deeply to empathetic individuals. Many empaths would rather spend weeks understanding something correctly than react impulsively and regret it later. This tendency creates another misunderstood behavior: delayed responses. Someone hurts them, days pass. Then suddenly they understand exactly why the experience affected them, exactly why the interaction felt wrong, exactly why something seemed off. People assume emotions shan't happen immediately. Empaths often experience emotional understanding in stages. The first stage is feeling. The second stage is reflection. The third is realization. The silence exists between those stages. Something else happens during that quiet period. Observation intensifies. This surprises many people. When empaths stop talking, often start noticing even more. They watch, they listen, they compare actions against words, they study patterns, not obsessively, naturally, because observation is how they make sense of the world. And what they discover during silence often determines the future of the relationship. Words matter. Patterns matter more. Anyone can apologize. Anyone can explain. Anyone can make promises. Patterns reveal truth. Empaths understand this intuitively. which is why they frequently trust behavior over language. When hurt, they become less interested in what people say and more interested in what people consistently do. This shift can be profound, especially for people accustomed to receiving endless empathy from them. Because once an empath enters observation mode, illusions start disappearing. Excuses lose power, contradictions become visible, intentions become clearer, and clarity changes relationships. There is also a protective mechanism operating beneath the surface. Empaths know what emotional pain feels like. Many have spent years learning how to avoid causing it to others. Because of this, they often struggle with confrontation. Not because they fear conflict, because they fear causing harm. They know words can wound. They know emotional injuries can last. So before responding, they think carefully. Sometimes too carefully. They consider consequences, perspectives, contexts, variables. This thoughtfulness can create silence that appears passive from the outside. But internally, enormous activity is taking place. The empath is evaluating not only what they feel, but what their response might create, how it might affect others, whether it will help, whether it will hurt, whether it will change anything at all. These questions matter, especially when relationships are important. Another hidden aspect of empathetic silence is disappointment. Not ordinary disappointment, expectation disappointment. Empaths tend to believe in people's potential. They often see the good in others long before others see it in themselves. This can be beautiful. It can also be painful, because seeing potential means creating expectations. And when reality repeatedly falls short of those expectations, disappointment accumulates. Not all at once, gradually, quietly, until eventually something changes. The empath stops trying to convince themselves, stops making excuses, stops translating bad behavior into acceptable behavior, stops carrying responsibility for choices that belong to someone else. This transition frequently occurs in silence. No announcements, no dramatic speeches. Just a gradual withdrawal of emotional investment. Many people don't notice it happening until it's already complete. That's because empaths rarely leave emotionally in a single moment. They leave in stages. A piece of trust disappears. A piece of hope disappears. A piece of emotional energy disappears. A piece of attachment disappears. Eventually, enough pieces are gone that the relationship no longer feels the same. The silence reflects that reality. Not revenge. Recognition. Recognition that something fundamental has changed. There is an interesting psychological principle at work here. People often value what becomes scarce. When an empath is constantly available, their emotional labor becomes invisible. People get used to it, expect it. They assume it will always be there. Then the empath goes quiet. Suddenly the absence becomes noticeable. The encouragement is missing. The patience is missing. The emotional support is missing. The understanding is missing. People begin recognizing what was present all along. Ironically, silence often reveals value more clearly than words ever could. Because absence creates contrast. Contrast creates awareness. Awareness creates understanding. For some empaths, silence is also a test. Not a conscious test, a natural one. They stop initiating, stop chasing, stop carrying conversations, stop maintaining the entire emotional structure of a relationship. Then they observe. Who reaches out? Who notices? Who cares? Who invests effort? The answers are often revealing. Relationships that seemed strong suddenly weaken. Relationships that seemed one-sided become obvious. Relationships that appeared balanced prove authentic. Silence becomes information. Information creates clarity, and clarity changes decisions. One reason empathetic people eventually become extremely selective with their energy is because they learn a difficult lesson. Not everyone deserves unlimited access. Compassion does not require self-sacrifice. Understanding does not require tolerance of mistreatment. Kindness does not require abandoning boundaries. Many empaths spend years learning these distinctions. Some spend decades, because their instinct is to understand everyone, even the people hurting them, especially the people hurting them. Tendency can become dangerous. Understanding someone's pain does not erase the impact of their behavior. Understanding someone's trauma does not remove accountability. Understanding someone's struggles does not justify repeated harm. Eventually, many empaths realize this, and when they do, silence often becomes stronger, not weaker, because boundaries are forming. Healthy boundaries, necessary boundaries, boundaries built from experience. The quietness people observe is often the sound of those boundaries taking shape. There is a version of an empath that exists before repeated heartbreak, and a version that exists after. The difference is fascinating. The earlier version assumes good intentions automatically. The later version verifies them. The earlier version gives endless chances. The later version watches for patterns. The earlier version explains every feeling. The later version becomes selective. The earlier version believes understanding alone can solve most problems. The later version understands that willingness matters too. People must want to understand. People must want to grow. People must want to change. Without willingness, empathy alone accomplishes very little. This realization often arrives through pain, and pain often arrives before wisdom. The silence becomes part of that transformation. Period of psychological recalibration. A period where priorities shift. A period where self-respect begins competing with self-sacrifice. This process can look cold from the outside. It usually isn't. Most empaths never stop caring completely. What changes is access. What changes is availability. What changes is investment. They stop pouring energy into places where it continuously disappears. Decision often feels harsh to people benefiting from their generosity. But from the empath's perspective, it feels necessary. Survival sometimes requires withdrawal. Healing sometimes requires distance. Clarity sometimes requires silence. Another observation appears repeatedly. The quietest empath in the room is often feeling the most. Because intense emotions don't always create loud reactions. Sometimes they create deep reflection. Deep reflection creates silence. Silence creates space. Space creates understanding. Understanding creates change. This cycle happens continuously beneath the surface, while others assume nothing is happening. Something else worth noticing is that empaths rarely forget how people made them feel. Not because they hold grudges, because emotional memories tend to remain vivid. Facts fade. Emotional impressions linger. A person may forget specific words. They remember the feeling those words created. They remember whether they felt valued, dismissed, respected, ignored, supported, abandoned. These emotional memories influence future trust, future openness, future vulnerability. When enough painful memories accumulate, silence becomes safer than exposure, not forever, but temporarily, until trust can be rebuilt. It can be rebuilt. That distinction matters. Because not every silence is an invitation. Some silences are conclusions. Some silences represent processing. Others represent acceptance. Others represent closure. The challenge is that from the outside, they often look identical. People hear nothing and assume nothing. Meanwhile, entire psychological transformations are occurring internally. This empath is reevaluating relationships, reevaluating boundaries, reevaluating expectations, reevaluating themselves. This internal reevaluation is rarely visible, but its effects eventually become impossible to ignore. The person who once tolerated everything begins saying no. The person who once explained endlessly becomes concise. The person who once chased resolution becomes comfortable with distance. The silence changes them. Not because silence itself is magical, because reflection creates awareness. Awareness creates decisions. Decisions create new behavior. And new behavior creates a different life. Many people spend years misunderstanding the empath who became quiet. They assume arrogance, resentment, bitterness. What they fail to see is the accumulation that preceded the silence. Hundreds of moments, hundreds of observations, hundreds of emotional calculations, hundreds of attempts to understand. The silence wasn't the beginning, it was the result. The visible result of an invisible process. And perhaps that is the most important thing to understand. When an empath goes quiet after being hurt, the silence is rarely empty. It is full of reflection, full of observation, full of unanswered questions, full of emotional processing, full of pattern recognition, full of lessons being learned, full of boundaries being formed, full of truths becoming impossible to ignore. While everyone else focuses on the absence of words, the empath remains inside that quiet space, examining every detail, comparing actions to intentions, separating reality from hope, separating patterns from promises, separating what was imagined from what actually existed, learning who showed up consistently, and who only appeared when convenient, learning where energy was appreciated, and where it was consumed without gratitude, learning which relationships contained reciprocity, and which survived entirely on their effort, learning that understanding others is valuable, but understanding themselves is essential, learning that compassion without boundaries becomes self-neglect, learning that kindness without discernment becomes vulnerability to exploitation. Learning that silence is not always weakness, and distance is not always cruelty. Learning that some people notice their absence, while others only notice the loss of what they provided. learning that healing sometimes sounds like nothing at all, while internally, an entire identity is reorganizing itself around new standards. New expectations, new awareness, and new respect for the emotional energy they once gave away so freely, without realizing how valuable it truly was.